The Boston winter greeted me with its characteristic chill as I stepped out of the Uber, my breath forming small clouds in the frigid evening air. After 3 exhausting weeks in Tokyo finalizing the Henderson merger, all I wanted was the familiar comfort of my Beacon Hill mansion. My driver had already placed my luggage on the cobblestone driveway, and I tipped him generously before watching his taillights disappear down the street. My house stood imposingly against the darkening sky, windows dark and uninviting exactly as I'd left it. The silence that awaited me inside was both a comfort and a reminder of my solitary existence. At 47, I had everything money could buy: the corner office at Hartwell Investments, vacation properties across 3 continents, and a collection of luxury cars gathering dust in my garage. What I didn't have was someone waiting for my return. I punched in the security code and pushed open the heavy oak door, dropping my keys in the hand-carved bowl that Emily, my interior designer, had insisted would add character to the entryway. The house's automated system sensed my arrival, gradually illuminating the foyer and adjusting the temperature to my preferred 72 degrees. "Welcome home, Mr. Hartwell," came the disembodied voice of my smart home system. "Resume normal settings, Alice," I replied, shrugging off my cashmere coat. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but tonight, an inexplicable unease settled over me. Perhaps it was jet lag, or maybe the lingering stress from the negotiations that had dragged on far longer than anticipated. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I headed straight for the bar cart in my study, pouring myself 3 fingers of Macallan 25, a small reward for closing a $2.3 billion deal. The amber liquid burned pleasantly down my throat as I loosened my tie and collapsed into my leather armchair. The silence of the house enveloped me, broken only by the occasional creak of the century-old wooden beams settling. Just as I was about to take another sip, the sound of knocking echoed through the house. I froze, glass halfway to my lips. It was nearly 10 p.m. on a Tuesday, and I wasn't expecting anyone. My security system hadn't alerted me to any visitors, unusual, given the sophisticated technology I'd invested in. The knocking came again, more hesitant this time. I placed my glass down carefully and reached for my phone, debating whether to call security. My neighborhood was one of Boston's safest, but years in business had taught me that preparation trumps optimism every time. "Alice, show me the front door camera," I commanded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell." "The front door camera appears to be offline," the AI responded with artificial concern. That was odd. I'd had the entire system checked before my trip. A third knock, so soft I almost missed it. With a mixture of curiosity and caution, I made my way back to the entryway. Through the frosted glass panels flanking my door, I could make out a small silhouette, too small to be an adult. A child? At this hour? My hand hovered over the doorknob. In my world of corporate takeovers and billion-dollar decisions, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. Yet something compelled me forward. I opened the door to find a boy, no older than 12, standing on my doorstep. The security lights illuminated his face, thin, pale, with dark circles under eyes that seemed too wise for his years. His clothes were clean but worn, his navy blue backpack faded from use. "Can I help you?" I asked, my tone more brusque than I'd intended. The boy didn't flinch. Instead, he studied my face with an intensity that was unsettling, as though searching for something specific in my features. "Are you Richard Hartwell?" His voice was steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I am," I confirmed, increasingly bewildered. "It's late, kid. Shouldn't you be at home?" A bitter smile crossed his face. "That's why I'm here," he said. "My mom always told me my father was named Richard Hartwell, that he lived in a big house on Beacon Hill." He paused, swallowing hard. "She died last month. Cancer." I felt the blood drain from my face as his words registered. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. "Look, there must be some mistake." "I don't have any children," I said firmly, though a cold sensation was spreading through my chest. The boy, I still didn't know his name, shrugged. "She said you wouldn't know about me. That you'd met at Northeastern when you were both students." Her name was Sarah Lawrence. "Sarah Lawrence." The name hit me like a physical blow, summoning a flood of memories I'd buried nearly 13 years ago. My final year at Northeastern, before Harvard Business School. Sarah with her literature books and fierce intelligence. Sarah with her dreams of becoming a writer. Sarah, who disappeared from my life after a passionate 6-month relationship ended with heated words and slammed doors. "Sorry to bother you, sir," the boy continued, his voice cutting through my thoughts, "but I think you are my father." His words hung in the cold night air between us. I found myself unable to speak, caught between disbelief and a strange, instinctive recognition I couldn't explain. "What's your name?" I finally managed to ask. "Ethan," he replied. "Ethan Lawrence. Not Hartwell." She hadn't given him my name. The realization stung in a way I wasn't prepared for. My mind raced through possibilities: a scam, a case of mistaken identity, or the truth. My first instinct was to close the door, call my lawyer, maybe even the police. This could be an elaborate ploy to extract money from me. But as I looked at Ethan, really looked at him, I noticed details that stopped me cold. The shape of his eyes, identical to my own. The slight cleft in his chin that I saw in the mirror every morning. And then, as he shifted his weight, the sleeve of his jacket rode up, revealing a distinctive mark on his forearm. My breath caught. Without thinking, I reached out, turning his arm gently to examine the birthmark, a small, irregular patch of darker skin with a distinctive shape that resembled a crescent moon. "This birthmark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have the same one." Ethan nodded slowly. "Mom said it was how she knew for sure. Said Hartwell's going back generations had it. She showed me pictures." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter night ran through me. The Hartwell birthmark was something of a family legend, documented in portraits dating back to my great-great-grandfather. I found myself at a crossroads, staring into the face of a child who could very well be my son, a child whose existence I'd never known about, whose mother had faced illness and death, without my knowledge or support. "You'd better come inside," I said finally, stepping aside to let him pass. "We have a lot to talk about." As Ethan crossed the threshold into my home, I felt something shift permanently in my carefully constructed world. The door closed behind us with a soft click that somehow sounded like the turning of a page, the beginning of a chapter one never expected to write. Inside my cavernous foyer, Ethan stood uncertainly, taking in the high ceilings and expensive artwork with wide eyes. I suddenly saw my home through his perspective: cold, impersonal, more museum than living space. The emptiness I'd grown accustomed to felt glaring and accusatory. "The kitchen's this way," I said, leading him through the house. It seemed the most normal place to have this conversation, though normalcy had fled the moment I'd opened my door. Ethan followed silently, his backpack clutched to his chest like a shield. In the bright light of my rarely used kitchen, I could see him more clearly. His dark hair needed a trim, falling into eyes that were undeniably familiar, the same shade of hazel as my own. He was small for 12, with the lanky awkwardness of early adolescence, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that spoke of a resilience beyond his years. "Are you hungry?" I asked, realizing I had no idea what to offer a 12-year-old boy. My refrigerator typically contained protein shakes, expensive wine, and takeout containers. "I'm okay," he said, though the way his eyes darted to the fruit bowl suggested otherwise. "Help yourself," I nodded toward the bowl. "When did you last eat?" He shrugged, reaching for an apple. "This morning." The social worker bought me breakfast. Social worker. The word hung between us, a reminder of everything I didn't know about his situation. "Where are you staying now?" "After your mother." I couldn't finish the sentence. "Foster care," Ethan replied matter-of-factly, though his knuckles whitened around the apple. "For the past 3 weeks. Before that, I was with Mrs. Reyes, our neighbor, while Mom was in hospice." The clinical way he described such profound loss left me speechless. 3 weeks in foster care after watching his mother die. Meanwhile, I'd been in Tokyo, my biggest concern whether Henderson would accept my final offer. "Mom left me a letter," he continued when I didn't respond. "And a box with some pictures, your old business card, and newspaper clippings about you. That's how I found this address." "You came here alone?" From where? Dorchester. I took the tea and walked the last bit. He bit into the apple, watching me cautiously. The foster family doesn't know I'm gone yet. They have 3 other kids and don't pay much attention. My mind reeled at the thought of him navigating the city alone, making his way to my doorstep on nothing but determination and his mother's word. We should call them, I said, reaching for my phone. They must be worried. Ethan's expression tightened. They're not. But you can call if you want me to leave. His quiet defiance stopped me. Whatever I'd expected from this encounter, it wasn't the composed, wary child before me. I don't want you to leave, I admitted, surprising myself with the truth of it. But I need to understand what's happening. Let's start with your mom. Sarah and we were together briefly in college, but that was 13 years ago. 12 years and 8 months, Ethan corrected. I was born July 12th. I did the mental math. Conception would have been around October, which aligned with when Sarah and I were together. My gut tightened as the possibility became more concrete. Why didn't she tell me? The question came out harsher than intended. Ethan's gaze dropped to the kitchen island. She said she tried to. Twice. The first time, your secretary wouldn't let her pass the lobby. The second time, you'd moved offices. I remembered those early days at Hartwell Investments, working 80-hour weeks, building what would become my empire. Had Sarah really tried to reach me? The thought that she might have been turned away, pregnant with my child, made me physically ill. After that, she decided it was better this way, Ethan continued. She said you were becoming someone important, and we would only hold you back. The casual way he voiced this abandonment, as if it were a simple fact rather than a life-altering decision, struck me like a physical blow. I had been becoming someone important, while Sarah raised our son alone. May I see the birthmark again? I asked, needing to focus on something tangible. Ethan rolled up his sleeve, revealing the distinctive crescent shape on his inner forearm. Without speaking, I did the same, pushing back my crisp white shirt to show the identical mark on my own arm. My grandfather had it too, I said quietly. And his father before him. It's called a nevus. The doctors wanted to remove mine when I was born, but my mother refused. Mom called it my moon mark, Ethan said, the first hint of emotion cracking his composed facade. She said it meant I was special. Something caught in my throat at the thought of Sarah creating magic from genetics, transforming a hereditary quirk into something meaningful for our son. Our son. The phrase echoed in my mind, foreign yet increasingly undeniable. I have pictures, I said suddenly, standing. Follow me. I led him to my study, the room where I felt most myself. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, though most volumes were for show, business biographies and economic texts my assistant had selected to impress visitors. What I sought was hidden behind them, a concession to sentimentality I rarely acknowledged. Reaching behind a row of leather-bound classics, I extracted a small, locked box. The key remained on my keychain, unused for years. Inside were the fragments of a past I'd packaged away when I decided that success required singular focus, old photographs, a few letters, the rare mementos I couldn't bring myself to discard entirely. With trembling fingers, I spread several photographs across my desk. Most were from my childhood, but one showed my grandfather, sleeves rolled up as he worked in his garden, the distinctive birthmark visible on his arm. Here, I said, pointing. And this one is me at about your age. Ethan leaned forward, studying the image of a gangly boy with a Red Sox cap and the same serious eyes. The resemblance between us became impossible to deny, the same jawline, the same slight asymmetry to our smiles. You played baseball? He asked, fixating on the detail that seemed least consequential to me. For a while. I wasn't very good. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Me neither. Mom tried to get me to join Little League, but I kept dropping the ball. This small shared inadequacy created an unexpected connection between us, more powerful than the genetic markers written in our features. I continued through the photos, finding one from my college days, a group shot from an economics club outing. And there, partially cropped but unmistakable, was Sarah. Her bright smile and dark curls brought back a flood of memories, Study sessions that turned into something more, her apartment with books stacked everywhere, the intensity of first love before ambition pulled me away. "That's Mom," Ethan whispered, touching the photo reverently. "She looks so young." "We both were," I replied, memories crystallizing into sharp relief. She was studying comparative literature. Brilliant. She could quote Shakespeare and Austen from memory. "She was still like that," Ethan said, his voice thick. "She read to me every night, even when she got sick." We were halfway through The Hobbit when he broke off, swallowing hard. The weight of Sarah's absence filled the room. This woman who had raised our child alone, who had cultivated his mind and protected his heart, was gone. And I hadn't known. Hadn't been there. "Ethan," I said carefully, "I need you to understand something. If I had known about you, if I had known Sarah was pregnant, things would have been different." His eyes met mine, skeptical beyond his years. Would they? The simple question struck at my core. Would they? Would I have abandoned my ambitions, my single-minded pursuit of success? Would I have chosen a family over the empire I'd built? I wanted to say yes with certainty, but the truth was more complex. The Richard Hartwell who had dated Sarah Lawrence was not the man I'd become, a man whose name appeared in Forbes and whose decisions affected thousands of employees. Back then, I might have stepped up. Now, I didn't know if I was capable of being what Ethan needed. Yet looking at this boy, this child with my eyes and Sarah's resilience, I felt something shift within me. The carefully constructed narrative of my life, the story I told myself about what mattered, began to unravel in the face of this new reality. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "But I would like the chance to find out now." Ethan nodded slowly, neither accepting nor rejecting my tentative offer. In that moment of fragile connection, his stomach growled loudly, breaking the tension. A startled laugh escaped me. "Let's get you some real food," I suggested. "Then we can figure out our next steps." As we made our way back to the kitchen, Ethan walked a little closer to me, the distance between us marginally reduced. The birthmark on my arm seemed to tingle beneath my shirt sleeve, a physical reminder of the blood tie that had brought this unexpected visitor to my door and the responsibility that came with it. After improvising a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches, the one meal I could confidently prepare, I made a series of calls that transformed my solitary mansion into a hive of activity. My first call was to Margaret Chin, my personal attorney, who listened to my halting explanation with professional calm before arranging an emergency meeting with a family law specialist for the following morning. Next came Dr. Brenda Harris, our company physician, who agreed to come to the house for a DNA test despite the late hour. "It's just a precaution," I explained to Ethan as we waited in the living room, the remains of our simple dinner on the coffee table between us. "To make everything official." He nodded, but I could sense his withdrawal. The tentative connection we'd established earlier had receded, replaced by wariness as strangers invaded the space where we'd begun to find common ground. Dr. Harris arrived first, her medical bag in hand, her expression carefully neutral. She performed the cheek swabs efficiently, explaining each step to Ethan in the kind, straightforward manner that had made her invaluable to Hartwell Investments. "Results should be back in 48 hours, she told me quietly as she packed up her equipment. "But Richard." She hesitated, glancing at Ethan, who was examining my collection of antique chess sets across the room. "The resemblance is quite remarkable." After she left, I made what proved to be the most difficult call to the Massachusetts Department of Children and Families. The conversation was lengthy and frustrating, full of bureaucratic language that barely concealed the complexity of the situation. By the time I hung up, it was nearly midnight, and Ethan was fighting to keep his eyes open. "You should get some sleep," I said, suddenly realizing I had no idea where to put him. My 5-bedroom home had never hosted a child. "I have a guest room that should work." I led him upstairs to the bedroom farthest from mine, a space decorated in neutral tones with an ensuite bathroom. Ethan looked lost standing in the doorway, his backpack still clutched in his hands. "Is this okay?" I asked, uncomfortably aware of how inadequate the question was. "It's bigger than our whole apartment was," he replied, his voice small in the spacious room. I helped him find a new toothbrush in one of the bathroom drawers, showed him how to work the shower, and retrieved a t-shirt he could sleep in. Each small action highlighted how unprepared I was for this responsibility, how foreign the rhythms of caring for a child. "If you need anything during the night, my room is down the hall to the left," I told him, hovering awkwardly in the doorway. "Alice can help too. Just say her name and ask for what you need." Ethan nodded, sitting on the edge of the bed with his hands folded in his lap. I was struck again by his self-possession, his careful containment of whatever storm must be raging inside him. "Good night, Ethan," I said, unsure whether to approach him, to offer some physical gesture of comfort. "Good night, Mr. Hartwell," he replied formally, and the distance in those words made my heart ache in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Back in my study, I poured myself another Macallan, needing its warmth to steady my hands. The events of the evening seemed surreal, like something happening to someone else. Yet the evidence was inescapable, from the physical resemblance to the birthmark to the timeline that aligned perfectly with my relationship with Sarah. Sarah. The thought of her sent another wave of complicated emotions through me. I opened my laptop and typed her name into the search bar, something I'd pointedly avoided doing for over a decade. The first result was her obituary from the Boston Globe, dated just 5 weeks earlier. The photograph showed an older, thinner version of the woman I'd known, but with the same intelligent eyes and warm smile. I read that she had been an English teacher at a public high school in Dorchester, beloved by her students and colleagues. That she had authored 2 young adult novels under a pen name. That she was survived by her son, Ethan. No mention of a husband or partner. No mention of me. I dug deeper, finding her professional profile on the school's website and several articles she'd written for educational journals. Her social media presence was minimal, but what existed painted a picture of a life centered around her son and her work, book recommendations, classroom activities, pictures of Ethan at various ages. In one photo, dated 3 years ago, they stood together outside Fenway Park, both wearing Red Sox caps. The caption read, "E's first game. He says the hot dogs were better than the baseball." The intimacy of these glimpses into their life together felt like an intrusion, yet I couldn't stop scrolling, hungry for every detail of the years I'd missed. Around 2 a.m., exhausted but far from sleep, I found myself reaching for the carved wooden box at the back of my desk drawer, a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside was a collection of letters and notes from my college days, including several from Sarah. Her handwriting, flowing and distinctive, brought her presence into the room with piercing clarity. One letter in particular caught my eye, dated just before our breakup. "Richard, I'm writing because I can never seem to find the words when we're together lately. There's a distance growing between us that scares me. I see the path you're on, the internships, the connections you're making, the plans you've mapped out. It's all you talk about now. I admire your ambition, truly. But I wonder if you realize what you're leaving behind as you race toward that future. What happened to the man who stayed up all night debating philosophy with me? Who said he wanted to change the world, not just profit from it? Who talked about balance and meaning, not just success? I love you, Richard. But I'm starting to think we want fundamentally different things from life. And if that's true, maybe the kindest thing we can do is acknowledge it now, before we hurt each other more." With love and sadness, Sarah, I remembered receiving this letter, remembered dismissing it as dramatic and unfair. I'd been working 18-hour days, positioning myself for a prestigious internship that would become the foundation of my career. Of course, I had less time for philosophical debates and romantic gestures. Sarah's inability to understand my ambition had seemed like evidence that we weren't compatible after all. Now, with the perspective of decades, I read another truth in her words. She had seen the transformation in me before I recognized it myself. Had watched as the idealistic student became consumed by ambition, as success became an end in itself rather than a means to something more meaningful. And when had she discovered she was pregnant? Weeks after our bitter parting? Months? Had she sat alone in a doctor's office, clutching the news that would change her life forever? Had she debated whether to tell me, weighing my right to know against what she perceived as my single-minded focus on career? The questions multiplied until my head throbbed with them. I needed answers only one person could provide, and she was gone. Around dawn, I found myself outside the guest room door, listening for sounds of movement. Hearing nothing, I pushed it open gently to check on Ethan. He was asleep, curled tightly on one side of the king-sized bed, as if trying to take up as little space as possible. In sleep, the guarded expression he maintained while awake had dissolved, revealing the child beneath the composed exterior. Beside the bed, his backpack lay open, a few possessions visible: a dog-eared paperback copy of The Hobbit, a Red Sox baseball cap faded from wear, and a small wooden box similar to the one where I kept Sarah's letters. The parallel struck me: mother and son, each preserving their precious memories in near-identical containers. I retreated silently, unwilling to disturb his rest. Back in my room, I sent a flurry of emails, canceling meetings, delegating responsibilities, clearing my schedule for the foreseeable future. For the first time in my career, Hartwell Investments would have to function without my constant oversight. By the time Ethan emerged, bleary-eyed and rumpled in my oversized t-shirt, I had ordered breakfast from my favorite cafe, researched temporary guardianship procedures, and compiled a list of the best private schools in Boston. "Morning," he mumbled, hovering uncertainly in the kitchen doorway. "Good morning," I replied, gesturing to the spread on the island. I wasn't sure what you liked, so I got options. He approached cautiously, eyeing the assortment of pastries, fruit, and breakfast sandwiches. After a moment's hesitation, he selected a chocolate croissant, reminding me so strongly of Sarah, who had the same weakness for chocolate at breakfast, that I had to look away. "What happens now?" he asked, perching on a bar stool, his legs dangling. The directness of the question caught me off guard, though it shouldn't have. Every interaction with Ethan revealed his preternatural maturity, a child forced to think like an adult too soon. "We have some meetings today," I said carefully, "with lawyers who can help us sort out the legal aspects of your situation. And I've contacted your foster family and the Department of Children and Families. For now, they've agreed you can stay here while we work things out." He nodded, processing this information with the same composed acceptance he'd shown throughout our encounter. "And if the DNA test says you're really my father? Then we'll make more permanent arrangements," I replied. "But Ethan, I want you to know something important. I already believe you're my son. The test is just a formality." His eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise I'd seen on his face. "You do?" "I do," I confirmed, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. "The evidence is pretty compelling, from the birthmark to the timeline too." I gestured vaguely at his face, at the features that mirrored my own. A flicker of relief crossed his expression before the careful mask returned. "Will I go back to foster care if you're not?" The question pierced me. Whatever happened with the DNA test, this child had come to me, had literally shown up on my doorstep with nothing but faith in his mother's word and his own courage. The idea of sending him back into the system now seemed unconscionable. "No," I said firmly. "One way or another, we'll find a better solution." Ethan studied me with those searching eyes, weighing my words against what must have been a lifetime of adult promises, some kept, many broken. "Okay," he said finally, returning to his croissant. We ate in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken questions and uncertain futures hanging between us. Outside, Boston was coming alive, the morning sun illuminating the historic streets of Beacon Hill through my kitchen windows. "Your mom?" I began hesitantly. "The obituary said she wrote books." "Under a pen name." Ethan nodded, a spark of animation brightening his face. "E.L. Carson. She wrote young adult novels about a boy who discovers he can travel through time using old books. There are 3 of them." "I'd like to read them," I said, meaning it. "Would that be okay with you?" The request seemed to touch something in him. "She'd like that," he said softly. "I have copies in my backpack. They're kind of beat up, though. I've read them a lot." "I'd be honored to borrow them," I replied, recognizing the magnitude of what he was offering, a piece of Sarah, preserved in ink and paper, shared with the man who had been absent for the creation of both the books and their son. As Ethan left to retrieve the novels, I found myself standing alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the trappings of a successful life that suddenly seemed hollow. For years, I'd measured my worth in acquisitions and achievements, in the expansion of Hartwell investments and the respect of my peers. Now, faced with this unexpected connection to a past I'd discarded, I was forced to confront a different metric altogether: the human relationships I'd sacrificed at the altar of ambition. The wooden box Ethan carried back down the stairs held more than just his mother's novels. It contained the possibility of redemption, of a life richer than the one I'd built for myself. Whether I was prepared for such a profound transformation remained to be seen, but as Ethan placed the books in my hands with solemn ceremony, I knew with absolute certainty that there was no going back to the solitary existence I'd left behind when I opened my door the night before. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of appointments and phone calls. Margaret Chin, ever efficient, had arranged meetings with family court judges, child welfare officials, and educational consultants. By Wednesday afternoon, we had secured temporary guardianship pending the DNA results and begun the process of formally enrolling Ethan in school. Through it all, Ethan maintained the same careful composure I'd observed since his arrival. He answered questions politely, signed documents when asked, and offered no resistance to the plans being made on his behalf. Only occasionally did I catch glimpses of the grief that must be consuming him, a distant look when Sarah's name was mentioned, a slight tremor in his hands when asked about his mother's illness. "You're doing remarkably well," Dr. Abernathy, the child psychologist Margaret had recommended, told him during our visit to her Newberry Street office. "But it's also okay not to be okay, Ethan. Grief isn't linear." He'd nodded in that serious way of his, absorbing her words without comment. Later, in the car, I'd asked if he wanted to talk about the session. "Not really," he'd replied, staring out at the rain-slick streets. "She's nice, but she keeps asking how I feel." "I don't want to talk about how I feel." I understood his reticence all too well. Wasn't I the same? Hadn't I built a life around action rather than introspection, achievement rather than emotion? That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I found myself pacing the length of my study, a tumult of emotions threatening the composure I'd maintained throughout the day. In the quiet darkness, with no meetings to attend or decisions to make, the full weight of my situation descended upon me. I was likely the father of a 12-year-old boy whose mother had died, whose world had been upended, who needed stability and guidance and love. And what qualified me to provide any of those things? I, who had chosen ambition over connection at every turn, who had built a fortune but no family, who had spent more time in boardrooms than living rooms. The self-doubt that had lurked at the edges of my consciousness since Ethan's arrival now roared to life, drowning out the voice of capability that had guided my professional life. I was utterly unprepared for this responsibility. What did I know about raising a child, about homework and school lunches, about nightmares and growing pains, about teaching right from wrong? My own father had been distant at best, cruel at worst. A self-made man with no patience for weakness, he'd treated parenthood as an inconvenience, a distraction from the serious business of accumulation. Was that the only model I had to draw from? Would I repeat his mistakes, turning Ethan's vulnerability against him, demanding perfection where there should be acceptance? I poured myself a drink with shaking hands, trying to drown these spiraling thoughts. The amber liquid burned down my throat, but brought no clarity. Instead, Sarah's face swam before me, not the Sarah of recent photographs, worn down by illness and responsibility, but the Sarah I'd known, vibrant, challenging, alive with possibilities. What would she think of me now? Of the man who had chosen wealth over love, who had climbed so high only to discover the view was empty? Would she see me as fit to raise her son, our son, or would she regret her final act of faith in telling Ethan who his father was? The questions had no answers, only the hollow echo of might-have-beens. I could have been there for Sarah's pregnancy, for Ethan's birth, for the 1,000 small moments that make up a childhood. I could have known my son from his first breath, not encountered him as a fully formed person bearing the imprint of a mother who had shouldered my responsibility along with her own. The regret was physical, a crushing weight on my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I found myself at the window, staring out at Boston's nightscape, the lights of the city blurring through unshed tears. Somewhere out there was the Dorchester apartment where Sarah and Ethan had made their life together. The school where she had taught. The hospital where she had died. A sound behind me broke my reverie, the creak of a floorboard in the hallway. I turned to find Ethan standing in the doorway, barefoot in the oversized t-shirt I'd given him, his hair rumpled from sleep. "Sorry," he said, his voice small in the darkness. "I heard noises." "It's just me," I replied, hastily wiping my eyes. "Can't sleep?" He shook his head, hovering uncertainly. "I had a dream about Mom." Something in his expression, a vulnerability he'd kept carefully hidden until now, compelled me forward. I crossed the room and, after a moment's hesitation, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Do you want to talk about it?" He shrugged, but didn't pull away from my touch. It wasn't bad. She was just there, reading like she used to. But when I woke up, he swallowed hard. When I woke up, I forgot for a second that she's gone. And then I remembered. The simple description of grief's cruel cycle undid me. Without thinking, I pulled him into an embrace, expecting resistance. Instead, he leaned against me, his thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I miss her so much," he whispered into my shirt. "I know," I said, though I couldn't know the depth of his loss. "I'm so sorry, Ethan." We stood like that for a long moment, this child who had lost everything finding comfort in the arms of a stranger who shared his blood. When he finally pulled away, wiping his face with embarrassment, I made a decision. "How about some hot chocolate?" I suggested. "My mother used to make it for me when I couldn't sleep." A flicker of interest crossed his tear-stained face. "With marshmallows?" "I think we can manage that," I said, though I had no idea if there were marshmallows in my pantry. "Let's find out." In the kitchen, we engaged in a shared mission, rummaging through cabinets until we uncovered not only the ingredients for hot chocolate, but a forgotten bag of mini marshmallows left over from some catered event. As we waited for the milk to heat, Ethan perched on a bar stool, watching me with cautious curiosity. "Did you really not know about me?" he asked suddenly. All this time. The directness of the question was startling, but I owed him honesty. "No, I didn't. If I had known, things would have been different." "Different how?" I considered this as I stirred the warming milk. "I would have wanted to be part of your life, to support you and your mother, to know you." He processed this, his expression thoughtful. "Mom said you were really smart, that you were going to change the world." The echo of Sarah's faith in the young man I'd been, a faith I had perhaps betrayed in becoming the man I was, struck me deeply. "Your mother was the smart one," I said quietly. "And braver than I ever was." "She was scared at the end," Ethan admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She tried not to show it, but I could tell." The image of Sarah facing death alone, trying to be strong for her son while grappling with her own fear, filled me with a profound sorrow. "That's why she was brave," I told him. "Being scared but doing what needs to be done anyway, that's real courage." Ethan nodded, absorbing this. "Are you scared?" he asked. "About all this?" The question caught me off guard with its insight. This child, not even a teenager, had pierced through my carefully maintained facade to the truth beneath. "Yes," I admitted, the word unfamiliar on my tongue. When was the last time I'd acknowledged fear to anyone, even myself? "I'm terrified of making mistakes, of not being what you need. But I want to try, Ethan, if you'll let me." He considered this with the same seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "I'm scared too," he confessed. "About living here, about starting a new school, about forgetting Mom." "You won't forget her," I assured him, pouring the hot chocolate into mugs and adding a generous handful of marshmallows to each. "We'll make sure of that. And as for the rest, maybe we can figure it out together." We carried our mugs to the living room, where the city lights cast a gentle glow through the windows. Sitting side by side on the leather sofa that had rarely held more than one person, we sipped our drinks in companionable silence. "Mom would have liked this," Ethan said after a while, gesturing around the quiet room with his mug. "She always said the best conversations happen late at night." She was right about that, I replied, a bittersweet smile tugging at my lips. Sarah was right about a lot of things. As the night deepened around us, we really talked for the first time. Ethan told me about his school in Dorchester, about his best friend Miguel, about the science fair project on renewable energy that had won him first place last year. I shared stories of my own childhood, of the grandfather who had taught me chess, of my first faltering steps in the business world. Neither of us mentioned the DNA test waiting in a lab somewhere, or the legal proceedings that would determine Ethan's future. Those realities would return with the morning light. For now, in the quiet sanctuary of night, we were simply two people finding common ground in the shadow of loss. When Ethan finally began to nod off, his empty mug clutched in relaxed fingers, I carried him back to his room, marveling at how light he was, how fragile. As I pulled the covers over his sleeping form, I was struck by a realization. Regardless of blood tests and legal documents, this child had already claimed a place in my heart that I hadn't known existed. And in that moment, I made a silent vow to Sarah. Wherever she might be, I would be worthy of her final trust in me. I would become the father Ethan deserved, even if it meant dismantling the life I'd built and creating something entirely new from its foundations. The DNA results arrived on Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier to my home office where I'd been working remotely since Ethan's arrival. I signed for the envelope with a steady hand that belied my inner turmoil. Though I had already accepted Ethan as my son in my heart, the official confirmation would set in motion legal proceedings that would permanently alter both our lives. Ethan was upstairs with Ms. Patel, the tutor I'd hired to help him catch up on the schoolwork he'd missed during Sarah's illness and aftermath. Their voices drifted down occasionally, Ms. Patel's gentle prompting and Ethan's thoughtful responses, creating a pleasant domestic soundtrack I'd never experienced in this house before. I waited until they finished their session, using the time to answer urgent emails and speak with my CFO about the company's operations in my absence. James had been surprisingly supportive when I'd explained the situation, offering to step in wherever needed without the judgment I'd half expected. "Family comes first, Richard," he'd said simply. "We've got things covered here." Family. The word resonated differently now, filled with possibility rather than absence. When Ms. Patel left, Ethan came downstairs, looking more animated than I'd seen him yet. "Ms. Patel says I'm actually ahead in math," he reported, a hint of pride in his voice. "She thinks I could do advanced placement when I start at the new school." "That's excellent," I replied, gesturing for him to join me in the study. "Your mother must have been a good teacher." "She helped when she could," he said, settling into one of the leather armchairs. "But I mostly figured it out on my own. Mom was more into English and history." I nodded, struck again by the resilience of this child who had learned to be self-sufficient far too young. "The DNA results came," I said gently, indicating the unopened envelope on my desk. Ethan's posture stiffened immediately, the relaxed demeanor for moments before replaced by the guarded expression I'd come to recognize as his defensive shield. "Oh," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Did you look at them?" "Not yet. I thought we should do it together." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the envelope as if it might contain not just scientific confirmation of our relationship, but the blueprint for his future. In a way, it did. With deliberate movements, I opened the envelope and unfolded the clinical document inside. The scientific language was dense, but the conclusion was unmistakable, a 99.9998% probability of paternity. Though I had expected this result, seeing it in official, irrefutable form sent a surge of emotions through me: relief, joy, terror, and, beneath it all, a profound sense of responsibility. "It's positive," I told Ethan, whose face revealed nothing of his inner thoughts. "I am your father." He nodded slowly, absorbing this confirmation. "So what happens now?" Before I could answer, the doorbell rang, an unexpected interruption that sent a flash of annoyance through me. "Let me see who that is," I said, setting the results aside. "We'll continue this conversation in a moment." At the door stood a small, fierce-looking woman with salt and pepper hair pulled into a severe bun. Beside her was a younger man in a rumpled suit, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. "Mr. Hartwell," The woman asked, her tone clipped and professional. I'm Diane Rodriguez from the Department of Children and Families. This is my colleague, Mark Winters. We're here about Ethan Lawrence. A chill ran through me. Yes, of course. Please come in. I led them to the living room where Ethan had appeared, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. His face paled at the sight of the social workers. Hello, Ethan, Ms. Rodriguez said, her tone softening slightly. How are you doing? Fine, he replied tersely, shooting me a panicked look. These are the social workers I told you about, I explained, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. They're just checking in as part of the process. Ms. Rodriguez settled herself on the sofa, arranging her sensible skirt with brisk efficiency. Actually, Mr. Hartwell, we're here because there's been a development in Ethan's case. My stomach tightened. A development? Sarah Lawrence's sister has come forward, Mr. Winters explained, opening his portfolio. Jennifer Lawrence. She's filed for custody of Ethan. The news hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had a sister? I asked, looking to Ethan for confirmation. He nodded, his expression a mix of surprise and confusion. Aunt Jenny. She lives in California. We haven't seen her in years. Ms. Lawrence has provided documentation of her relationship with Ethan and expressed her desire to care for her nephew, Ms. Rodriguez continued. As a blood relative, she has certain legal priorities in this situation. I understand that, I said, fighting to maintain my composure. But I've just received confirmation that I am Ethan's biological father. Surely that takes precedence. Ms. Rodriguez's expression remained neutral. Biological parentage is certainly a factor, Mr. Hartwell. But the court will consider multiple aspects of Ethan's well-being, including the stability of his environment, existing family relationships, and his own preferences. I felt as though the ground were shifting beneath me. After days of adjusting to the idea of fatherhood, of imagining a future with Ethan in my life, this new obstacle seemed cruel, a reminder that nothing was certain, that happiness could be snatched away as quickly as it arrived. When will Ms. Lawrence arrive in Boston? I asked, already calculating legal strategies, ways to prove I could provide the best home for Ethan. That's just it, Mr. Winters said. She's not coming to Boston. She's requesting that Ethan relocate to San Francisco to live with her. I looked at Ethan, whose face had gone completely white. No, he said suddenly, the first real defiance I'd heard in his voice. I don't want to go to California. I barely know Aunt Jenny. Ethan, honey, Ms. Rodriguez began in a placating tone, your aunt is family. So is he, Ethan interrupted, gesturing toward me. He's my father. Mom wanted me to find him. That's why she told me about him before she died. The raw emotion in his voice struck me to the core. This was the most Ethan had revealed about Sarah's intentions, about the conversation that must have taken place between mother and son as she prepared him for a world without her. Mr. Winters cleared his throat uncomfortably. While Ethan's preferences will be taken into account, Ms. Lawrence has raised some concerns about the situation, particularly about the fact that Mr. Hartwell has had no involvement in Ethan's life until now. The implication stung, though I couldn't deny its fundamental truth. I had been absent for 12 years, however unwittingly. What right did I have to claim fatherhood now, against the wishes of someone who had known Ethan his whole life, however distantly? Perhaps we could discuss this privately, I suggested, not wanting to conduct this conversation in front of Ethan, whose distress was palpable. Ms. Rodriguez nodded, turning to Ethan with a gentle smile. Would you mind giving us a few minutes to talk with Mr. Hartwell? For a moment I thought he might refuse, but then he nodded stiffly and left the room, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a physical weight. Once he was gone, I faced the social workers with determination. I understand Ms. Lawrence's position, but I cannot allow Ethan to be uprooted again. He's lost his mother, his home, everything familiar. To send him across the country to live with an aunt he barely knows would be traumatic. Your concern is noted, Ms. Rodriguez replied, but Ms. Lawrence has made some specific allegations that we must address. Mr. Winters consulted his notes. She claims that you were aware of Ethan's existence, but chose not to be involved in his life. That Sarah Lawrence attempted to contact you multiple times over the years. The accusation took my breath away. "That's absolutely false," I said, my voice tight with suppressed anger. "I had no knowledge of Ethan until he appeared at my door 3 days ago. Sarah and I parted ways before she knew she was pregnant, and she never informed me of his birth." "Can you prove that?" Ms. Rodriguez asked bluntly. The question hung in the air, unanswerable. How could I prove a negative, the absence of knowledge, the calls that never came? My history with Sarah existed in a time before digital footprints, before every interaction left a trace that could be recovered years later. "What I can prove," I said finally, "is that I'm committed to Ethan now. That I have the resources and the desire to give him a stable, loving home. That uprooting him to send him to California would cause further trauma when he's already dealing with the loss of his mother." The social workers exchanged glances, a silent communication I couldn't interpret. "There will be a hearing," Ms. Rodriguez said eventually. "Both you and Ms. Lawrence will have the opportunity to present your case to a family court judge. In the meantime, the temporary guardianship remains in place." "When is the hearing?" I asked, already reaching for my phone to call Margaret. 2 weeks from today," Mr. Winters replied. "We'll need to conduct home visits and interviews before then, with both you and Ethan, separately and together." After they left, I found Ethan in the kitchen, methodically arranging and rearranging a bowl of fruit, his face set in lines of concentration that couldn't mask his anxiety. "They want to send me to California," he said without looking up. "To live with Aunt Jenny." I sat across from him, choosing my words carefully. "Your aunt has requested custody, yes. But nothing has been decided yet." "I don't want to go," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never even been to California. And Aunt Jenny, she and Mom weren't close. They argued a lot. She only visited twice that I can remember." I reached across the island to still his restless hands. "Ethan, look at me," I said gently. When he raised his eyes to mine, I continued, "I'm going to do everything in my power to keep you here, if that's what you want. But I need to know, is staying here with me really what you want?" The question seemed to surprise him, as if the idea that his preference mattered was novel. "Yes," he said after a moment, with a certainty that warmed me. "Mom wanted me to find you. She wouldn't have told me about you if she wanted me to live with Aunt Jenny." The simple logic of the statement struck me as profound. Sarah, facing the end of her life, had directed Ethan to me, not to her sister. Whatever our past, she had trusted me with our son's future. "Then we'll fight for that," I promised. Together. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Margaret assembled a team of top family law attorneys. We gathered character references from colleagues and friends, documented the changes I'd already made to accommodate Ethan, and began the process of formally enrolling him in a private school near my home. Through it all, Ethan and I grew closer, our initial wariness giving way to tentative moments of connection. We established routines, breakfast together before his tutoring sessions, walks around the neighborhood in the evenings, chess games that he approached with the same serious concentration he brought to everything. One night, as we sat in the study after dinner, Ethan working on a science assignment while I reviewed legal documents, he looked up suddenly. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, setting aside my work. "If the judge says I have to go to California." He paused, swallowing hard. "Would you still want to see me sometimes?" The question broke my heart with its reminder of how tentative our connection still was, how fragile the trust we were building. "Ethan," I said, moving to sit beside him, "no matter what happens, you are my son. Nothing and no one can change that. If circumstances force us apart, I will move heaven and earth to remain in your life." He nodded, blinking rapidly against what might have been tears. "Good," he said simply, returning to his assignment. That night, lying awake in the darkness, I confronted the reality that had been building since Ethan's arrival. I loved this child. Not just as an obligation or a responsibility, but with a depth and ferocity I had never experienced. The thought of losing him to a distant relative who had shown no interest in his welfare until now filled me with a desperation that bordered on panic. For the first time in my adult life, I found myself praying, not to any specific deity, but to whatever forces might control the chaotic universe. "Let me keep him," I pleaded silently. Let me be the father he deserves. Whether anyone was listening remained to be seen, but the act of asking, of admitting my vulnerability and need, felt like its own kind of breakthrough, a crack in the armor of self-sufficiency I'd maintained for so long. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, more intimate than the vast corporate litigation spaces I was accustomed to. Polished wood and subdued lighting created an atmosphere that was serious without being intimidating, appropriate for a place where families were made and unmade with the stroke of a pen. Ethan sat beside me, uncomfortable in the navy blazer and khakis Margaret had suggested for the hearing. His hair, freshly cut at a barbershop that specialized in children, made him look older, more like the photographs of me at his age that we'd discovered in my mother's attic during a weekend visit to her place in Cambridge. Across the aisle sat a woman whose resemblance to Sarah was startling, the same dark hair and delicate features, though lacking the warmth that had animated Sarah's face. Jennifer Lawrence had arrived in Boston 3 days earlier, declining my invitation to meet Ethan before the hearing. Her lawyer, a slick corporate type whose aggressive tactics had become clear during pre-hearing negotiations, sat beside her with an expression of practiced concern. Judge Eleanor Washington, a Black woman in her 60s with a reputation for fairness and child-centered decisions, studied the documents before her with careful attention. The courtroom was mostly empty, just our legal teams, the social workers, and a court reporter whose fingers moved silently across her stenotype machine. "Before we begin," Judge Washington said, looking up from her papers, "I'd like to speak with Ethan privately in my chambers." My heart hammered in my chest. Everything could hinge on what Ethan said in that room, on how well he could articulate his feelings about a situation that would overwhelm most adults. "It's okay," I whispered as he stood, shooting me a nervous glance. "Just tell the truth." He nodded, following the judge and her clerk through a side door. The 20 minutes that followed were among the longest of my life. I sat rigid in my chair, resisting the urge to pace or badger Margaret with questions she couldn't answer. Across the aisle, Jennifer Lawrence studied me with open hostility. I'd spoken with her only once, a tense phone conversation that had done nothing to bridge the gulf between us. She believed I'd abandoned Sarah, that I'd known about Ethan all along and chosen not to be involved. No amount of explanation could convince her otherwise, perhaps because her narrative cast her as the rescuer, riding in to save her nephew from a neglectful father. When Ethan returned, his face revealed nothing, though he seemed calmer than before. Judge Washington resumed her seat, arranged her papers, and addressed the courtroom. "I've reviewed all the submitted documents, including the social workers' reports, character references, and financial disclosures from both parties. I've also spoken with Ethan and considered his wishes in this matter." She looked directly at me, then at Jennifer. "This is not an easy case. Both parties have legitimate claims and concerns." My hands clenched involuntarily beneath the table. Margaret placed a steadying hand on my arm, a silent reminder to maintain composure. "Ms. Lawrence," the judge continued, "your desire to care for your nephew is commendable, and your status as his maternal aunt gives significant weight to your petition. However, I'm troubled by the lack of contact between you and Ethan in recent years, particularly during his mother's illness." Jennifer's face flushed, but she remained silent as Judge Washington turned her attention to me. "Mr. Hartwell, while I accept that you were unaware of Ethan's existence until recently, the fact remains that you have no experience as a parent. Your work history suggests a demanding schedule that could limit your availability to care for a child." I nodded, acknowledging the truth in her assessment. The judge's expression softened slightly. "That said, I'm impressed by the immediate steps you've taken to adjust your life and create a stable environment for Ethan. The reports from social services indicate a genuine bond developing between you, and Ethan himself has expressed a strong preference to remain in your care." A flicker of hope ignited in my chest, though I kept my face carefully neutral. "After careful consideration, I've decided that Ethan's best interests will be served by granting primary physical custody to Mr. Hartwell, with liberal visitation rights for Ms. Lawrence." The relief that flooded through me was so profound I nearly missed the rest of her ruling, details about education, healthcare decisions, holiday schedules. Beside me, Ethan released a breath I hadn't realized he was holding, his small body relaxing incrementally as the judge continued. However, Judge Washington added, fixing me with a stern gaze, "This custody arrangement will be subject to review in 6 months. I expect reports from both the school and the appointed family counselor regarding Ethan's adjustment and well-being." "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Across the aisle, Jennifer's face crumpled briefly before she regained control. Despite our adversarial positions, I felt a flash of sympathy for her disappointment. She had lost two, first her sister, now the chance to raise her nephew. After the formal proceedings concluded, Margaret guided us through the paperwork that would make Ethan officially my son in the eyes of the law. As we prepared to leave, Jennifer approached, her lawyer hovering protectively nearby. "I want you to know," she said, her voice tight with controlled emotion, "that I'll be watching. If you fail him in any way, I'll be back in court so fast your head will spin." Before I could respond, Ethan stepped forward. "Aunt Jenny," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." Her expression softened as she looked at him. "You have nothing to be sorry for, sweetie. This isn't your fault." "I'd still like to visit sometimes," he continued. "To talk about Mom. You knew her longer than anyone." A complex emotion crossed Jennifer's face, grief mixed with a grudging acceptance. "I'd like that," she said finally. "We'll work something out." In that moment, watching my son extend an olive branch to the woman who had fought to take him from me, I felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly overwhelmed me. This child, with his innate wisdom and compassion, was teaching me about grace even as I fumbled to teach him about life. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing the events of the day. Rain began to fall, soft and steady against the windshield, as Boston's skyline came into view. "So it's official now?" Ethan asked as we turned onto Beacon Hill, breaking the companionable silence. "You're really my dad? Legally and everything?" "Yes," I replied, glancing at him in the passenger seat. "If that's still okay with you." He nodded, looking out at the familiar streets we now shared. "Yeah, it's okay." The simple acceptance in those words meant more than any corporate victory I'd ever achieved. At home, as Ethan went upstairs to change out of his court clothes, I wandered into the study that had once been my sanctuary. The room had transformed over the past weeks, Ethan's school books sharing space with my financial reports, a framed photo of Sarah that Jennifer had reluctantly provided now holding a place of honor on my desk. My phone buzzed with a message from James. "How did it go?" "We won," I typed back. "Ethan stays with me." His reply came instantly. "Congratulations, Dad." The word struck me with its simple truth. I was a father now, not just biologically or legally, but in all the ways that mattered. The responsibility was terrifying, but the joy it brought was unlike anything I'd experienced in my pursuit of wealth and status. That evening, breaking our usual routine, I suggested we go out to celebrate. Ethan chose Regina Pizzeria in the North End, his face lighting up as we entered the bustling restaurant with its checkered tablecloths and heavenly aromas. "My mom and I came here once," he explained as we settled into a booth. "For my 10th birthday. She saved up for months." I imagined Sarah budgeting carefully to give her son this special treat, calculating to the penny what they could afford. The thought humbled me, highlighting the vast gulf between the life they had shared and the privilege I had taken for granted. "It was the best birthday ever," Ethan continued, studying the menu with serious attention. "Until Mom got sick, anyway." "Tell me more about her," I said, realizing this was a request I'd made too seldom in our time together. "What was she like as a mom?" His face softened at the invitation. "She was strict about some things, like homework and bedtimes. But she was funny too. She did different voices when she read stories, and she knew all these weird facts about books and history." As he spoke, painting a portrait of the woman who had raised him with such love and courage, I felt Sarah's presence between us, not as a painful reminder of my absence, but as the vital connection that had brought us together. "She wasn't perfect," Ethan added, with the insight that continued to surprise me. "She worked too much, and sometimes she got mad about little things when she was really mad about big things. But she always said sorry afterward." "That's more than my father ever did," I said without thinking. He believed apologies were a sign of weakness. Ethan considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "That's dumb," he decided. "Mom said being able to say you're wrong is actually brave." I laughed, delighted by his directness. Your mom was a wise woman. Our pizza arrived, steaming and fragrant, momentarily interrupting the conversation. As we ate, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of the popular restaurant, I found myself observing the families at neighboring tables, the easy interactions between parents and children who had grown up together. The shorthand communications developed over years of shared experiences. Ethan and I didn't have that history, that comfortable familiarity. We were still learning each other's rhythms, still discovering the boundaries of our new relationship. But watching him now, animated as he described his old school's disastrous science fair, culminating in an accidentally launched bottle rocket that had destroyed the principal's toupee, I felt a deep certainty that we would build our own traditions, our own shared language. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, I found myself drawn to Sarah's novels, which now held a place of honor on my bookshelf. I'd finished the first two, marveling at her talent for creating worlds that were magical yet grounded in emotional truths. The final book in her trilogy remained, the one she'd completed during her illness. Opening it, I discovered a dedication I hadn't noticed before, for E, who taught me the true meaning of love, and for R, who gave me the greatest gift. The simple words blurred before my eyes. R, she had acknowledged me, had recognized my unwitting contribution to the life she cherished most. The generosity of this gesture, made when she must have been facing her own mortality, perhaps even contemplating the journey Ethan would make to my door, humbled me completely. In the quiet of my study, surrounded by the trappings of the successful life I'd built, I finally allowed myself to grieve for Sarah Lawrence, for the brilliant, passionate woman I had known briefly in youth, for the devoted mother who had raised our son alone, for all the conversations we would never have about the remarkable person Ethan was becoming. The grief was pure and cleansing, washing away the last vestiges of the man I had been, the man who had measured his worth in acquisitions and achievements, who had believed that success could fill the spaces where love should have been. Morning found me asleep in my chair, Sarah's book open on my chest. I woke to the sound of Ethan moving around in the kitchen, the domestic noises of cabinets opening and closing, the refrigerator door's distinctive hum. Joining him, I discovered he had already started breakfast, eggs cracked into a bowl, bread sliced for toasting. "I make pretty good scrambled eggs," he explained with a hint of pride. "Mom taught me." "I'd love to try them," I replied, marveling at this small revelation. So much about him remained to be discovered, his preferences and talents, his fears and dreams, the thousand details that made up a life. As we moved around the kitchen together, establishing a tentative choreography, I felt the first true stirrings of family, not the idealized version I might have imagined, but something real and imperfect and infinitely precious. Outside, Boston was coming alive, the spring sunshine illuminating a world of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before Ethan's arrival. There would be challenges ahead, Jennifer's promised vigilance, the court's 6-month review, the everyday complexities of raising a grieving child. But for perhaps the first time in my adult life, I faced the future with something beyond ambition or determination. I faced it with hope and with the profound understanding that true wealth had nothing to do with the figures in my bank account and everything to do with the boy sitting across from me, carefully monitoring the eggs that would soon become our first breakfast as a legal family. "Is something wrong?" Ethan asked, catching my contemplative gaze. "Not at all," I replied, smiling at my son. "Everything is exactly as it should be." And in that ordinary moment, a Tuesday morning in a Beacon Hill kitchen, the smell of slightly overdone toast in the air, I found the extraordinary gift Sarah had sent to my door, the chance to discover what truly matters, and to build a life around that knowledge before it was too late.